So now let's jump in for part one of our mechanical and tech tonight. And this is part one of flushing your differential. So what you're going to need before you start. So what I like to do is make sure that you have all the things that you're going to need before you get started. So you kind of take everything, we have like a shelf, a bench that is right next to the Jeep in the garage. So you get everything that you're going to need, put it together, so that way you know you have everything before you get started. So what you're going to need before you start. So over here on the left, so what you're going to need is a gasket maker. And we're going to talk about this in depth in part two. They do make rubber seals, rubber gaskets that you can use with your differential and your differential cover. But if you're going to be doing a lot of off-road driving where you're going to have a lot of water crossings, you're going to be in a lot of mud, where you feel like you're going to be flushing your diff frequently, those rubber seals don't always reseal great. This is, again, the brutal honesty of kind of being out there and doing something. So they're going to say those seals and those gaskets are going to work, that you can use them and you can reuse them, one or two times before you have to buy a new one, and that you can just buy a new rubber seal and gasket that is going to go on for your diff, which is great. But reality is we have had a lot of issues with those pre-made rubber gaskets that you can buy not sealing correctly, after some time breaking down, the seal not being great, and then you have a leak. And the one thing, you definitely want to be taking care of is your diff, because there's so many important parts, so many little, teeth in there. You want to make sure that you have a good seal so that you're not leaking, because if you're leaking diff fluid, that means it's slowly draining out of the differential, and you don't want to run it without differential fluid in there. So what we do, and again, we're going to go into this in depth in part two, is we actually use a gasket maker. We're going to show you how to do that. We use gray just because we have the aluminum. So it matches. Now, if you have painted your differential and differential cover, if you've painted your undercarriage, you can try to get something that's going to color match a little bit better. You don't have every color in the world choice. So if you went kind of specific with the color of like your diff cover, if you had it kind of custom painted, you can get close, but it's not going to be identical. So we do gray, just that way, since we have the aluminum, and you don't really see it, because it needs to seal, needs to be inside, in between your diff cover, and your plate when you put it on to seal it. Then the other thing you're going to need is your oil, gear oil. So we use Royal Purple, and of course it's the 75W90. Then the other thing is brake cleaner, and any kind of just generic brake cleaner, like this actually is just an AutoZone bottle of brake cleaner, but you're gonna want a couple bottles of brake cleaner as well. And then one of the most important things is you want to make sure before you start that you have a catch pan. They make different kinds. They make, like, this is a plastic one. It works really well. It doesn't make a mess. It has lots of room, so it's a bigger one. These are great. I know they make metal ones. You can use different pans, different things. I like this because it has like the lid on it. The ones that are just like the pan, I feel like you have a higher risk of spilling it when you go to move it. So this is what I do recommend. But again, you can use anything, whatever works for you, whatever you want to use. Make sure you have that catch pan. Make sure that if you have used it for an oil change, if you've used it to flush your diff before, whatever it may be, make sure that you have recycled the fluid out of this. And that is something to remember before you get started. Make sure this is empty, because what you don't want to do is already have like oil from an oil change in there. Then you drop your diff cover, everything starts to drain, you have diff fluid running in there, and then all of a sudden it overfills and you make a huge mess. So this is again about being prepared ahead of time. So make sure that you have an empty catch pan for you to drain into. And then I always like to have like an old rag or a towel, because no matter how careful you are, there's going to be a little bit of a mess, whether it be on your hands, whether it be trying to wipe anything that spills, whatever it may be. And then also, this is the point, if you want to wear like rubber gloves to keep everything off of your hands, make sure you have those before you get started, because you want to put those on from the very beginning. You don't want to wait. Otherwise, it's pointless to put those on. A couple things I wanted to bring up. So now the differential has been flushed and we let it dry overnight for 24 hours before we move on to this part 2. Everyone has their own way of doing things, and I just want to take a super quick minute and share with you ladies, everything that we share with you here on LadyJeepers.com from Lady Jeepers is always going to be what I call conservative. We always are being cautious, being conservative. We want to give you the way that we do things to kind of set you up for the best success. Do you need to wait 24 hours? No. Do we suggest that you wait 24 hours? Yes, and that's because we do as well. So that is not necessary, but we always do everything on the overcautious side when it comes to working on the Jeep. So I was thinking about that earlier today, so I had to look up the actual meaning and definition of the word cautious. So the actual meaning is of a person careful to avoid potential problems or dangers. And some synonyms are careful, wary, aware, attentive, alert, watchful, vigilant. So think about that as you start to move forward and do things. When we're sharing with you, we are always kind of sharing the overkill side or the overcautious, or what's going to set you up to avoid any potential problems. So somebody might tell you, man, you don't have to do that. You don't have to wait, and you don't have to, but we're just sharing with you what we think is the way to do things, because then you don't ever have any problems. So let's jump in. So you already should have everything that you need together, because we started talking about that last week on class 1, but I want to do a super quick overview. Part of that being because there are some different things to think about. So you want to make sure that you have your bolts for your differential. Now, something to think about is make sure you have the bolts that you took off of your differential cover. When you took it apart like you did in part one, you store them, put them in a bag, put them in a cup, whatever it may be, Ziploc bag, put those aside and make sure that you are storing those so that you don't lose them. So now let's say you take them out, and this is what we ran into a little bit. You know, your Jeep is out, it's used a lot. Maybe, you know, unfortunately, it has some rock rash. It has taken some abuse because that differential, as we talk about, is going to be the lowest point, and it's going to be your first contact point because that is the lowest point. Therefore, it is going to take the most abuse when you are out, if you are kind of pushing it to the limits with some more like extreme off-roading. So we ran into this. So when we removed the bolts, we had some that you could tell where the differential had taken a little bit of rock abuse. So those bolts are no longer usable. So then you need to make sure you take the exact bolt that you had in there and you go, like we went to Tractor Supply, you know, go to an Ace Hardware, wherever you have around you, and get matching bolts. Now, if they don't have the exact identical, they still, the big important part is they need to be the correct length and about the correct width. Excuse me, ladies. So they're going to be the same. So now these are the bolts that came because we changed out and modified the differential as well. So on your normal how to flush, you know, and change your differential fluid, what you're doing is putting the same bolts back in. If for some reason there's some damage, you would try to replace them with some that are similar. So make sure you have the right pieces of equipment. So for example, these bolts took a different socket. So these actually took a 12-point socket because I don't know if you can see it says 12.9 on the bolt. And if you can see the shape of the head, and it went in to a 3/8 inch drive. So that is a new piece, as you can see over here, that we had to buy to fit the new screws that go in the new Moto-Built diff cover. So make sure when you're talking about bolts, keep the bolts, make sure you have the correct sockets and equipment that you're going to need as you move forward. So then the other thing is washers. If you're going to need washers, so if you took your bolts off and they had washers on them and some of them are damaged, maybe they've been on there for a long time, so you want to go ahead and replace those. Again, you can go to a hardware store, a Tractor Supply, and get these washers. Take in your old washer and make sure that you get the identical washers when you buy them, so that they're going to work with the size screw that you have, but they're also going to work with the differential cover that you have as well. So it's not going to affect the seal that you're going to get. Another quick overview, make sure you have the correct wrench and socket. So for the bolts on the differential, might be a different size socket and wrench than it will be for your actual differential plug. So that's something, don't just assume, oh, okay, I have a socket, you know, so it'll work. Make sure you have the right equipment. So make sure it's the right socket, make sure that you have the right wrench. Because like, for example, our bolts went on a 3/8 and our differential plug right here, we had to put on a 1/2 inch drive or wrench. So they were two totally different sizes. So make sure you have the right wrench and socket. And again, keep in mind, you might need two different ones. Then we're going to talk really quickly on this. So you can buy a rubber gasket. So if you have a stock Jeep, it's the first time you're changing out the differential fluid. In the newer Jeep, the chances are you have a rubber gasket. So when you take the differential off, like you did in part one, you're going to notice that there's a rubber gasket that goes between that cover when you put the differential cover on, and it kind of squishes, for lack of a better word, it's like squishing, to create that seal so that you don't have any leaks. Now you can go ahead and buy a replacement. They say that you can reuse those 2 or 3 times. From experience, I'm going to say to you that is not true. And you're going to end up with some leaks. I'm not saying huge leaks, but you're going to notice moisture and some leaks coming from your differential if you continue to reuse that rubber gasket. So our recommendation is either go buy another brand new rubber gasket like what you had on. You can get those, at any auto supply store, or so like what we do. And this again is, on a YJ. We do this on the CJ. We have not done the differentials yet on the JKU, but we will be switching to the gasket maker as well and not continuing to run the actual rubber gaskets that come on those. That is up to you and that is your choice. If you are more comfortable knowing that you have the stock manufacturer's rubber gasket to make your seal on there, there's nothing wrong with that. I just really recommend don't reuse them, even though they tell you that you can, because you don't want to put all this work in, get everything mounted up, and you have an area that's leaking a little bit because of that rubber gasket. So going the rubber gasket route is totally fine, but make sure that you replace it. So what we're going to show you today is actually using this gasket maker. So what this is going to do is we're going to show you how, instead of buying that rubber gasket that we're going to put in between when we put our diff cover back on to make that seal to hold all of the differential fluid inside there, we're going to make our own gasket that is going to go in between those to make that seal. So that's what we're going to show you today. Then another thing is your gear oil. Lots of different types out there. Make sure that you know what you need to get and what the specs are based on what you're running inside your differential. So for us, we get the royal purple. I mean, I don't love purple, so I'm sure that has nothing to do with it. I think I got a clip somewhere when we were videoing of Chad going, and we have to spend more money to get the purple because it's purple. But no, so there are different kinds. We've always used this even before the purple Jeep. So just make sure that you're getting the right gear oil. So it's going to be synthetic oil. So like this is the royal purple synthetic oil, and it's the 75 W90. And you want to make sure that it says gear oil on it as well, so that you are putting the correct lubrication back in the differential in your rear end. So then another thing that you're going to want to have if you are doing this, making your own gasket, you will need this, which is a box of tongue depressors, and we will show you why as we get down the road. So first, you're going to start by sanding or scuffing the surface that you're going to be mounting back together, because this is going to ensure a better seal with that gasket. So I don't know if you can remember, that's probably the reason I wanted to show you part one really quickly and how dirty all of this was. Just all the leftover gasket, the dirt, the grime, everything that was on here that is going to affect the seal. And then also I want you to see the difference, and how nice the differential looks now that it has been cleaned. I love to show off this Jeep, of course, but make sure you're going to start by either sanding this or scuffing it so that you are making a better seal for this surface, and you're getting, again, the whole reason why we're flushing this this differential is to get all the grime, the little, there might be little metal pieces depending on, the age of your gears. There's lots of different things that can happen inside that differential. So what you're trying to do is get the grime out, the dirt out, any little metal pieces that may be starting to accumulate in there. Water that has built up in there if you have been doing water crossings and when you are four-wheeling on your Jeep. So you don't want to just clean the inside and forget about the outside. So make sure you take a sandpaper to this edge, or you go ahead and use an attachment on the drill so that you're also going to sand and scuff the differential cover as well. So this is going to be the top of the differential cover, as you can see, that is going to mount back to the differential. So this is the differential cover. So we just cleaned around the surface on both sides that are going to mount together to make a better seal. I don't know why it restarts it. Sorry, ladies. Then another tip, the next thing that you are going to do, and this should be good because I know I like to be organized. I'm sure you ladies have figured that out about me by now, but lay everything out under the Jeep. So you know you're gonna have to be under the Jeep to do the differential, but you want to make sure you have everything you are going to need all together underneath there. So everything is, you know, within arm's reach, everything's together. You're not gonna have to try to go find anything, stop what you're doing, get up, anything like that. So you wanna make sure you take everything you're gonna need, put it underneath the Jeep together so it's right there and ready for you. Then the next thing you're gonna do, so you already have everything laid out under the Jeep, it's ready for you, you've scuffed the surfaces. Now it is time to either apply your rubber gasket that you've gotten. And what you're gonna notice if you get a rubber gasket is it is going to be the same design as your differential cover. So you can lay your differential down, put your rubber gasket on top, move it, make sure it's all lined up. We're going to show you, since we don't use the rubber gasket, this is how we make the gasket for our Jeep. So what this is the gasket maker. And you're going to make sure that you really are going around the holes to make a really good seal, as well as in between. So you're doing a nice, it's almost like cake piping, if you were to try to compare it to something. So it's almost like doing a cake or a cupcake, but you want to make sure that you go all the way around the holes so that when you do go ahead and mount these surfaces together and apply pressure, you're going to actually see this as we do it, but you're going to notice that you can see how all that material is going to expand and cover the areas that are open as it goes to make its own seal. So you have to go all the way around the entire differential cover, making sure that you really get a good layer in between your holes and then around your holes as well. Again, if you like doing icing or cake decorating, this is perfect for you. But no, so just, it doesn't have to be perfect. That's the big thing. There's no perfect way to do it. Just make sure you kind of get an even layer of that material all the way around the differential. So when you're finished, this is the differential cover upside down and what it would look like, or what it does look like with the gasket maker on it, so that you can see, you know, it's a pretty even design and this is what it's going to look like. And now you're going to be ready for the hardest step in the entire process. And it is putting the differential cover back on, because they are not light. So contrary to what people might think, they are not light. They can be heavy. So it can be easier with two people. And of course, if you have a lift, so you can have your differential more at kind of like shoulder height, or up above just a little bit so you can be standing up nice and straight, it's going to be so much easier. We did this video and we're showing you ladies how to do this in our house, which we do not have a lift at the house right now. I know that's on the list of what Chad would like, but so we are showing you if you were going to be doing this at home, in your garage, in your driveway, this is exactly what you're going to do. So the very first step is going to be, you're going to take 2 screws, you're going to find your top 2 holes in the differential cover and run your 2 screws through to start with. So that is how you're going to start to install the differential cover. Then next, what you're going to do is, now that you have the 2 screws already in the differential cover, you're going to lift it up and line up the holes of the differential cover and start with the very 2 top screws. So one kind of on each side, depending on what kind of differential you have. Remember, we talked about this last week. they're different shapes and different sizes. So that is going to affect the size of your differential cover, and it's also going to affect where the hole placement is, depending on what kind of differential that you do have. Like depending on what kind of axle you have, that is going to dictate what size differential you have as well. So, you know, if you kind of think about it, the smaller axles are going to have a little bit smaller differential, which means they're going to have a smaller differential cover, which means the holes are going to be slightly different. Some are shaped different as well. So that'll play into it as well. But make sure you start with the top 2 screws, and then you're going to go to your 2 of your bottom screws. So essentially what you're doing is you are putting even pressure on that differential cover as you are going to seal it, so that you're going to have 2 at the top, 2 kind of wide at the bottom, and you're going to start there with those 4 to put them on, so that you're evenly distributing that pressure as you're putting it on. Because you don't want to start, you know, like at the top, and then all of a sudden, you know, there's no pressure on the bottom or on the side. So if you can think about doing kind of those 4 square even pressures here to start with, and then go, and the next step will be, then you are going to go ahead and hand thread the remaining bolts. So you're going to go ahead and take all of the bolts by hand and just kind of stick them in and run them around so that they're already starting to thread. Then you're going to go back and go ahead and torque and tighten your bolts. Now, if you're using a rubber gasket, as you're going through this, what I recommend is go all the way around all the bolts, then go back starting at the top and torque them down all the way around. So that, and then one more time, so that you don't just really torque, you know, all of them down all at once at the very beginning, so that you're kind of tightening them, really torquing them down. And then also another thing is, if you are using, so we're using the gasket maker, you're not going to totally torque them. So what you're going to do if you're going to use this and go ahead and make your own gasket like we did, you're going to, you know, hand thread them in, go back, get them tight, but you're not going to come back for that last time and torque them yet, because as you can see, like I talked about, as these are tightening, see the gasket is already starting to come out because it's kind of being squished. So you're kind of seeing that excess is coming out. Well, we don't want to over torque it, because we need to allow that gasket seal to set up, so that it's going to seal and it's going to be set in between those two. Then you go back and torque it the rest of the way to ensure for a better seal. So if you're using, like we are here, the gasket maker, you can see from just, you know, tightening these, and this isn't torqued all the way, just tightening them, you can see the excess that has kind of started to squeeze out. So what you're going to do before this sets up is you're going to go ahead and take, we were talking about that tongue depressor, and you're going to take that tongue depressor and run around the outside of your differential cover, of your differential, and get all of that extra kind of goo off. Now, if you don't get all of it off, is it going to make a big deal? No, this is more for looks. You know, you could leave it on there like that if you wanted to, let it set up, torque it down, run it like it is. So functionality performance-wise is not going to make a difference. That is just for a neater, cleaner look. So you'll go back with the tongue depressor and scrape all that excess off. Then you have to let it set for 24 hours. So you're going to have to walk away from it, come back the next day, and then you're going to go ahead and torque down all of the bolts. So now is when you're going through and you're really tightening up all the bolts. So that way, everything is set up, it's dry, it's ready to go, and you can go back and finish torquing. And again, so I'm going through and I'm trying to torque each one all the way around, and then come back for that very last one, and really make sure that they're all nice and tight and torqued all the way. So when I'm doing it, I like to go, like these were already tight, but you can see I'm able to tighten them quite a bit more. So I like to go till as tight as I can get it, and then kind of bump the wrench and then try to go a little bit more, and try to get them as tight as I can. You know, and depending on what you're doing, we'll share this down the road. There are times you can use like a sleeve of metal to go over your wrench to get, so you have a longer piece, and that's going to give you a little bit more torque. These, you don't want to over tighten and over torque, because you don't want to break these bolts. You know, these are not like putting your lug nuts on your tire. These are still bolts, and they're a little bit different. You want them, you know, torqued and tight, but you don't need to get such a crazy amount of pressure on them because you don't want to break them. Then the last thing, now that you have it all put back together, and you want to make sure that you had your cap off of your differential cover before you put it on. That was a big thing, so that you could get it all on, get it all set up, and you already had the cap off before you put it on. So now we're going to go ahead and go to our last step. And you're just going to squeeze until nothing comes out. It's hard for me to multitask. Talking and doing things. No, I'm just kidding. So a couple things to keep in mind is if you are going to have multiple vehicles, you're going to be changing and flushing differentials, things like that. They make bigger bottles that have pumps on the top and tubes that come out. Like for this Jeep, for example, it took 2 bottles is what was recommended of the gear oil. So those are the bigger, I mean, they're big bottles, but it didn't demand enough because we had already done this CJ not too long ago to get like a big, huge bottle, so that you have the pump and then you have the tube that'll run into that differential to fill it up. You can do it either way, whatever you are more comfortable with. And then also think about when you're going to torque down the plug for the differential cover, you want to make sure you get it tight. You torque it a little bit and it's nice and tight, but again, you don't want to overdo it. Now it needs to be snug, it needs to be tight so that nothing leaks. But this is not something that you need to put just a ton of extra torque and pressure on. I'll be honest, so I can't get things as tight maybe as some other people. So for me, a short sleeve that will go on the end of the wrench to help to give it just a little bit more length, to get a little more torque is perfect. I don't need the big long one you're going to use because you have to jump on, this big long extra extension when you're trying to do stuff with lug nuts. So it's very different. So just remember, you do need to get them tight. You do need to torque them so that you don't have anything leaking. But at the same time, you don't need to overdo it where it is just so crazy tight. Oops. So then a couple things to think about is make sure you have the right tools and items that you need before you start. So before you ever start with part 1 and start to take apart your diff, start to take the diff cover off, make sure you have all of the right tools and things that you're going to need before you get started. And try to have them all together so that you're not trying to search and find things. Another thing, ladies, is make sure you put the differential cover on the correct direction. So before you start getting into, you know, any of the parts of part 2, make sure to take the time to line it up. So you're going to hold up the differential cover, line it up, look at it, make sure that it is fitting correctly, it's the correct direction. And then another kind of go-to is make sure that the company logo is on the correct side. So it's up so you can read the logo, and that'll help as well. So just think about that before you start putting it back together, because if you do where you make your own gasket, what you don't want to do is put it on and then go, oh my gosh, it's upside down, pull it off, and then turn it and put it back on. You want to make sure you've already taken those couple minutes to kind of hold everything up, make sure you know what directions it's going to go, so that when you get to that part and you're ready to continue forward.